Last month, RT launched a new opinion show called SPUTNIK, hosted by the Respect Party Member of Parliament, George Galloway. Now, if you're not familiar with Galloway, you should be. Whether it's taking on the UN over its oil for food program or blasting the Western Empire in the halls of Parliament, Galloway has done it all over the course of his decades-long political career. And earlier this year, Galloway launched a Kickstarter to create and promote a film called The Killing of Tony Blair. Although he only asked for £50,000 to make it, he received well over £160,000 for the project to date. Galloway joined me earlier from London, and I first asked him what he's hoping to achieve with the film.
Our first objective is to have Mr. Blair removed as the so-called peace envoy, which is the most inappropriate appointment since Caligula appointed his horse as a proconsul of Rome. Secondly, to make him so toxic that decent people and decent corporations, if they exist, will no longer wish to hire him. And our highest aspiration is to have him on trial at The Hague on charges of crimes against humanity and war crimes. Now, that's a very ambitious movie, but it's not as far-fetched a set of objectives as it once would have looked. And so we have now more than 6,000 donors to this movie, growing every day. And I think that this film is going to be one of the films of 2014. I hope so. And it has a raft of executive producers of note, including Max Kaiser and Abby Martin of RT.
Proud producer, George. I'm really excited about how well the film's doing. I cannot wait to see it. Other than doctoring up evidence for the Iraq War, briefly touch upon the other crimes that you think Tony Blair is responsible for that we might not know about here in the U.S.
Well, the title, The Killing of Tony Blair, is a triple entendre. The first killing was his killing of the Labour Party as we knew it. And I was a member of it for 36 years before he expelled me in 2004 and abolished my parliamentary constituency, hoping that one way or another he'd be rid of me. The killing of the Labour Party was a crime against the working people of Britain, because every country needs a Labour Party, including your own country, I may say. A party that will stand up for working people whose interests are entire and separate from the interests of other classes in the society. The second killing is obvious. It's the killing of 1 million people in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and by extension in Lebanon and in Palestine and many other places. And the third killing is the financial killing that Mr. Blair is making out of the previous two killings. By destroying the Labour Party, he made Britain safer for the corporations. He made their tax bills shrink. He made their regulatory burden disappear. And now they're rewarding him for all of that financially by paying him sums of money that are simply eye-watering. He now entered the Sunday Times rich list. He is officially one of the richest people in Britain.
Let's hope that when Tony Blair is brought to The Hague because of your film, he'll not plead affluenza, too wealthy to have a moral conscience, which is what we just saw here in the U.S. Shocking precedent set there. Let's move on to Parliament, though. Recently, the editor-in-chief of The Guardian, along with journalist Glenn Greenwald, were called to testify under Britain's terrorism law. Greenwald said that the UK government's trying to equate journalism with terrorism. As a member of Parliament yourself, what do you see as the real purpose of these hearings?
Well, it's a reign of intellectual terror, really, and edging into physical terror. The British security services actually entered the editorial rooms and editorial floor of the Guardian newspaper and broke hard disks on a newspaper's computers, smashed them into pieces. This is, even by the standards of the British state, a step not only too far, but one that has never been taken before, at least not in peacetime. Although I suppose we're perpetually at war now, so that's what they might say in justification. But of course, The Guardian was only telling us what our rulers are doing, and doing with our money and in our name. And the idea that they should be allowed not only to keep these things secret, but when these secrets are revealed, take such draconian, punitive, piratical measures as invading newspaper offices and breaking up their hard disks is truly extraordinary. And the more shocking still is that the rest of the British media has completely ignored this story, as indeed they have more or less completely ignored the Snowden affair in any detail right from the beginning.
I wanted to move on to Syria because there's a huge story that just came out, of course, relating to you directly. Dr. Abbas Khan, the British man held by Assad's forces, was scheduled to be handed over to you and instead found tragically dead, George. According to security officials, he committed suicide. I mean, can you tell us any more information about this case?
It was to be a Christmas gesture. And then, 4 days before my departure, he was found dead in his cell. Now, there are two things that must be obvious here. First of all, Bashar al-Assad did not order the killing of this man. That would be simply absurd, because if he was going to do so, why did he make such extensive arrangements for me, of all people, someone who stood by Syria through all of this terrible 3 years, to go to Damascus to pick up the prisoner? If he was going to execute him, he definitely would not have done that. Equally obviously, though, I'm sorry to say, it's pretty inexplicable, pretty implausible that Dr. Khan committed suicide, because he knew that I was coming in 4 days to take him home. He was elated at that news. He said so to his mother and in letters home to his sister and brother. And so the idea that Dr. Khan committed suicide just before getting his freedom is equally implausible. That, I'm afraid, leads to a very, very dark third option, and that is that somebody inside the apparatus of the Syrian state is not under the control of the president, and in fact set out to wreck a gesture being made by the president of Syria, and that does not augur well.
Unfortunately, there's so many state actors involved with all their vested interests. It's really hard to tell who's telling the truth without being a pawn in this global chess game, George. I'm really happy you're keeping up the pressure. Hopefully we get answers soon. But I wanted to move on to this accidental drone bombing of a wedding in Yemen by the U.S. What do you think would happen if a wedding was accidentally bombed here in America or in Britain by Yemen?
The even more despicable part of this story is that, I promise you, this has not even made the news. Neither the BBC nor Mr. Murdoch's Sky News have yet reported that perhaps dozens of guests in a wedding convoy in Yemen were destroyed, torn into pieces from a sofa somewhere in Washington, presumably, or elsewhere in the United States. Someone pressing a button and wiping out a wedding convoy. And the paradox is unbelievable. They are prepared to destroy innocent wedding guests in Yemen in their war against Al-Qaeda, and yet they are arming and funding Al-Qaeda in Syria. That's the point I've been trying to make about the Dr. Abbas Khan story. Britain is up to its neck, as is the United States, in blood and gore in Syria, but they're on the side of Al-Qaeda in Syria, whilst they're wiping out wedding guests in Yemen, supposedly in a war against Al-Qaeda. And of course they're getting away with it because the so-called mainstream media simply averts its eyes, passes by on the other side of the road. And the question you asked me, of course, doesn't even need an answer. Imagine if Iran had bombed a wedding party in the United States, or bombed a wedding party in Britain. Imagine if the Chinese Navy was in the Florida Straits in the way that the United States Navy is in the South China Sea. Imagine if President Putin was on the streets of Mexico agitating anti-American upheaval in the way that John McCain is on the streets of Kiev agitating anti-Russian feeling. If you begin to put these paradoxes, line them up, I mean, you don't know whether to laugh or cry. So far-fetched are they, and yet it's really happening.
Oh man, well, I'm laughing right now because it is just so absurd. The contradiction is staggering. I would imagine that we would be in World War III right now, George, if that happened. And speaking of this scenario, Yemen now banned.
Definitely we would. Yeah, definitely. I mean, look at their reaction when President Putin paid for a page advert in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or wherever it was. Imagine if he showed up on anti-American demonstrations in Canada. Can you imagine it?
Well,
Yet that's what European and American leading politicians are doing.
It's the reverse Iron Curtain, George. Speaking of the scenario, Yemen now banned drones in their country, but the UK government has already made a statement that it's not ruling out drone bombing them in the future. I mean, why is the government already ignoring Yemen's sovereign decision here?
Pakistan made the same sovereign decision, but it hasn't stopped Britain and America firing drone missiles at Pakistan, and they don't give a damn about the national sovereignty of Pakistan. And more fool Pakistan for continuing to describe itself as an ally of the very people who are bombing them. And in the case of Yemen, the political situation is a bit less clear, but nonetheless, the Yemeni government's sovereignty doesn't add up to a row of beans. These countries will be bombed as and when white men in Britain and black president in the United States have their kill meetings on Tuesdays or Thursdays and decide that they're going to fire rockets at these people. You remember President Obama made a joke about it. He said that boyfriends sniffing around his daughters, you don't see them coming, just like drone missiles. It's true. You don't see them coming until your wife is minus her head sitting next to you, until your daughter is lying in pieces in front of your eyes. You don't see them coming. Yeah. But the hatred and bitterness that they leave behind is sowing dragon's teeth for a terrible harvest further down the line. Because I'll tell you this, if my family was wiped out by a drone, I would devote the rest of my life, and I'd encourage my sons to devote the rest of their lives to getting revenge on the people who had destroyed us.
And one thing we can see coming is the wave of anti-American sentiment in the wake of all these drone massacres. George, let's wrap this up. You've got a show on this network now. It's called Sputnik. Talk about what the show is, how people can find it. We have about a minute left. Sputnik
orbiting the world with me, George Galloway, and my wife, Gayatri. And we are located in London, and I hope that people will check it out on the website of RT and follow us at RT_Sputnik. Follow us on YouTube. So I'm very glad on this and on many other things to be a comrade of yours, Abby Martin.
Same to you, George. Much respect. UK Parliament member, Respect Party. Amazing to have you on.